issues of social theory and deals with issues of anti-Semitism and social theory. We have two eminent intellectuals who will be leading the session. The first speaker is Bill Kolbrener. Bill is originally from New York. He was a student at Columbia College as an undergraduate and then went to the University of Oxford. And he's currently a professor of English literature at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He's written books on John Milton, Mary Estelle, and Joseph Soloveitchik, and is currently working on a book that's entitled Melancholy Aesthetics from Milton to Addison. And he's focusing on reading and the failure of liberal education on right and left. The parallels in his work and this parallels his work on issues of anti-Semitism. His next book will focus on Israel and anti-Semitism, also in relation to current education models. And William, we're privileged to have as an ISGAP research fellow. Benny Weinthal will be the second speaker. Benny is a research fellow at the Washington-based Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. He's the European Affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. Benjamin analyzes and reports on issues of global anti-Semitism, Iran, political Islam. A lot of his work deals with Germany and the international arena. He's widely published. He's based in Jerusalem and Berlin, and he uncovers valuable information on Iran's energy links to the European forums, and also on Hamas and Hezbollah's terror finance operations in Europe, which is very important work. He's also examined the growth of the Islamic State in Europe, growing anti-Semitism on the continent, and the reemergence of neo-Nazism. So it's wonderful that these two leading thinkers on the issue is with us. William will speak. The title of William's talk is BDS and the Decline of Humanities in the Classroom. And Benny will be speaking after William, and his title is Making Sense of Guilt Defense Anti-Semitism in Europe. So I'm going to give about 12 to 15 minutes to each speaker, and then we'll be able to have a conversation, a Q&A with everybody involved.
Charles, I think we said 20. I think we said 20.
All right, we're negotiating already. But,
we're not, no, I mean, I'm just holding you to the contract, that's all.
All right. All right, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So while I work at Bar-Ilan with a very brilliant young colleague, Daniel Feldman, and he and I tried to run a non-BDS classroom. He couldn't be here today, so I thought I would read the two paragraphs that he wrote me on email while you look at this image, which I'm sure you've seen before, from the Strasbourg Cathedral. On the left is Église, on the right is Synagogia. Whether or not anti-Semitic in design, this is Daniel, the doctrine of Christian supersessionism postulated by the early church fathers was certainly anti-Semitic in effect. The notion that Christianity had replaced Judaism and supplanted rabbinic teachings with more enlightened theology served to justify denunciations and persecutions of Jews for their benighted errors. Okay, these are very good, right? They're revised after the Holocaust in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Suppressionism is alive and well, and here's the transition to what we're doing today, although not in the pews of the church. Instead, a malignant form of academic supersessionism has taken root in social and critical thought that serves to blame Jews and especially Israelis for failing to heed the philosophical lessons of the Holocaust, which is the crazy irony. Ideas first espoused by German Jewish refugee intellectuals that were subsequently appropriated, as I will explain, by thinkers such as Foucault and Edward Said, to claim that the mantle of victimhood had passed on. Jews had been superseded by their critics. Whether academic or not, by design, this academic and intellectual scourge has undeniably been anti-Semitic in effect, as any survey of contemporary academic polemic about Israel and Palestine will attest. So I think Daniel really sets up what I'd like to talk to you about in the next 20 or so minutes, and I hope you can see a shared screen. Daniel's really, we're really talking about a kind of the provenance of anti-Semitism in the academy. Where does it come from? What are its origins? I mean, I think these questions are important to ask because we don't have narratives for students who are at Yale or Columbia or Harvard who are faced with a barrage of narrative coming from the Palestinian side. And I mean, I have a niece and a nephew, and they went to Pritzker and to Barnard, and I see their perspective has been entirely shaped by the woke landscape. Meaning, from their perspective, I have no expertise in this because I'm already too implicated in the problem. So the woke campus is a very real problem. It's a problem for Israel. It's a problem for education in general, because BDS is the tip of an anti-liberal iceberg, and it's really the BDS denial of genuine difference to Israel shows the extent to which, in some sense, the progressive movement takes a little bit from Christianity, what Daniel really just said. I'm going to repeat that because I want to make sure that it's clear that, I mean, so there's a whole thing of intersectionality, right? And what happened in Philadelphia with the food truck? Somebody tell me. Food truck was not allowed if there's a rainbow coalition of minorities and everybody is included except for the Jew. The exclusion of the Jew is not that their Jew is one of the things that just we have to exclude. The Jew is the basis upon which that whole BDS intersectionality is based. Jewish claims for exceptionalism, Jewish claims for being in Western culture first. So for me, it's important to provide a story, a narrative for students who are facing BDS loud and clear on American campuses. And I'd like to do a little bit of that with you today. And I'm going to take the 20 minutes that I thought I was going to have. This is just from the Israel Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, which shows that BDS is considered to be a real danger to the state of Israel. The past decade has witnessed an intensification of the delegitimization campaign against Israel. This campaign is a global, systematic, and ongoing effort to undermine Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state. And Charles spends all of his life fighting against this, right? The campaign's manifestations include, just skipping to the bold, the campaign's manifestations include the effort of the BDS movement against Israel. Long-term success, this is the line I wanted to read, long-term success of the delegitimization campaign holds the potential of serious damage to the security of the state of Israel and Jewish communities around the world. Right? This is an Aish Torah, right? This is not some yeshiva in the old city. This is the Institute for National Security Studies, meaning it's a genuine assessment of risk. See? My computer just went out. I don't know why that just happened. My computer just went out. So
it's still
going on our end. Still going on mine. So just move inside. I cannot see you, but you can still see me. I really have to get. Let's see. Sorry for this embarrassing moment. I'm coming back to what we were discussing. You have the handout in front of you. I as yet do not have the handout in front of me, but let's go for it here. So it's actually considered a national security list. Since I don't have the handout, I mean, what should I do here? Shall I try to reboot here, or do you want to read the quotations to me?
Well, we can't scroll with you, so it's if you want to use the handout, I think you'll have to reload it. Yeah. I think we just lost Bill.
Hello?
Bill, can you hear us?
No, I'm here.
Bill, can you hear me?
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you now. Are we back? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you.
I'm just sorry. I'm at this hotel. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So what Daniel mentioned in his in the paragraphs that I read is the kind of the genealogy, the provenance of this. Now, this is another statement, just again to see the prolificness of BDS in American universities. So here's a statement on Israel, Palestine by scholars of Jewish studies and Israel studies. Scholars of Jewish studies and Israel studies. We also acknowledge that the Zionist movement, a diverse set of linked ethno-nationalist ideologies, these are all like curse words, right? Ethno-nationalist ideologies, also was and is still shaped by settler colonial paradigms. I am a literary critic, and you can just feel the clunkiness of the jargon here, aside from it being insane exaggeration. And you see on the bottom in the next section, Jewish supremacy, ethno-national segregation. They love ethno-national, right? That does a lot of work for them. So that's the Israel Society and the Jewish Studies. Here is the gender studies in solidarity with Palestinian feminist collective. I mean, the ironies are so thick here because feminism is non-existent in the territories. So here's, in solidarity, we call for the end of Israel's military occupation of Palestine and for the Palestinian right to return to their homes. As residents, educators, and feminists who are also against the settler colonization of the US, we'll throw that in, we're also against America, right? Because we don't want to pick Israel out. We refuse to normalize or accept the United States' financial, military, diplomatic, and political role in Palestinian dispossession. Furthermore, I love this, we will not tolerate any censorship nor retribution against Palestinian scholars, activists, and those openly critical of the Israeli state. Now, nota bene, this is part of a statement that is written to boycott Israeli scholars, right? We will not tolerate the boycott of Palestinian scholars, but it's fine to boycott Israeli scholars. Meaning it's not that we're against boycotts, but we're against boycotting Palestinians. It's fine to boycott Israelis. Also, what is does the feminist collective have a position paper on the genocide happening in China? Why are feminists writing these things? Now, again, on the one hand, the food truck, the Dyke March in Chicago, I know it sounds like I'm screaming a lot, and these are really the main headlines. But the ideology of the American university, and I know this from my niece and nephew and also friends who teach there, woke doctrine, and I hate using the cliche, but woke doctrine is so dominant that there's no way really of resisting it. It's funny really that in the name of resistance, one is really stuck. And I see my colleagues in America who have told me that they self-censor because there are certain things they cannot do. Conversation, and this is really the tragedy of the BDS classroom. The tragedy of the BDS classroom is that conversation is no longer seen as a virtue. Conversation is seen as a possibly repressive activity. Since everything is converted into power relations, I'm sure most of you have read Foucault, right? Foucault is the dominant force still in critical theory, right? Since everything is power relations, any kind of relationship is going to be threatening to me. So identity politics dictates that I preserve myself. And preserving myself means that I don't engage with others because others are out to get me. And that is a function of the BDS classroom and the woke classroom. And what we try to do at Bar Ilan, which is very different from that classroom, is we say, yeah, conversation is a virtue. You can learn from other people, right? You have a generation of people, and this is happening also at Harvard Law School. They are questioning the presuppositions, the assumptions behind the student-teacher relationship, behind the student-teacher hierarchy. That is yet for them another hierarchy. And that's all it is, just another hierarchy, which can be turned over. It's one of the depressing things really is that in the name, using liberal principles, there is the slow undermining of liberalism in America. And that's true on the left and the right. More true on the left, that the left is using liberalism almost to commit suicide. Let's just look at a couple of more quotes. I think I started at 408. And Daniel had mentioned the work of the Frankfurt School. So that's the Frankfurt School. The people we know best are Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Adorno, you may know, he's famous for saying no poetry after Auschwitz. They wrote a book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And this book became a kind of centerpiece in critical theory that again eventually turned against Israel. So Adorno and Horkheimer, in exile from Germany in California, right, they kind of diagnose, they're Marxists who give a kind of diagnosis of why the Holocaust happened. So here, just in the bold, reason itself, the main item in the origin of positive classicism isn't eclipse or decline, but it is the source of the eclipse. Reason is undoing itself. The application of reason to society through science, democratization, and industrialization involving the progressive domination of nature through technological and commercial expansion tragically entails the progressive domination of people as well. So Adorno looks at fascism as reason gone out of control. Kind of German idealism turns in on itself, and the force of the Nazis is to embody embody reason completely without any check. Now I'll just show you a few more quotations about the Palestinian appropriation of this kind of language. That is the idea that somehow enlightenment itself is the problem of political movements. Enlightenment itself caused fascism. So here's Edward Said in his famous book, Orientalism, and the appropriation is pretty in your face. Of course, I'm the last Jewish intellectual. You don't know anyone else, this is in the New Yorker. All your other Jewish intellectuals are now suburban squires. He's talking about like my parents and who live in Long Island, right? The bourgeoisie, right? The Jews are the suburban squires and he's the activist. From Amos Oz to all these people here in America. So I'm the last one, the only true follower of Adorno. Let me put it this way, I'm Jewish Palestinian. And then he goes on and says, Frankfurt critical theory, despite its seminal insights into the relationship between domination, modern society, and the opportunities for redemption through artist critique, is stunningly silent on racist theory, anti-imperialist resistance, and oppositional practice in empire. Said is really appropriating the perspective of critical theory for Middle Eastern studies. And he himself is the last intellectual, and the Palestinians are the real Jews. Here's a conversation with Michael Walzer, who is a political scientist. But the one thing I want, and I'll conclude with this in one more quote, but the one thing I want Michael Walzer to remember, right? That's called, I don't know what that's called. It's called Said-splaining, right? But the one thing I want Michael Walzer to remember is that the more he shores up the sphere of exodus politics, the more likely it is that the Canaanites on the outside will resist and try to penetrate the walls, banning them from the goods of what is, after all, partly their world too. That part is true. The strength of the Canaanite, that is the exile position. Adorno, the exile in Germany, leaves for California, becomes the intellectual in exile. And here Said is appropriating that image as well of the Jewish intellectual. The strength of the Canaanite, that is the exile position, is that being defeated and outside, you can perhaps more easily feel compassion, more easily call injustice. I had Said as a professor at Columbia. He was great on the novel, but this rhetoric is out of control, right? More easily call injustice, more easily speak directly and plainly of all oppression. It's kind of like you want to sing some national anthem now. And with less difficulty, try to understand, rather than mystify or occlude his story, history, and equality. So Said here is putting the Canaanite is now higher than the Jewish exile, and the position of critique that the Jews have always had is now the Palestinian one. Now here is kind of the reductio ad absurdum of that position, and we'll end with this. He calls Gaza an open air prison, a concentration camp, right? So that kind of follows, right? But so here, just reading this, right? But hasn't Gaza as a camp, a concentration or internment camp, also become that reified totality of the world, the way our donor diagnosed it? So again, using the terms of critical theory, now to talk about a non-existent reality in Gaza. And here's some more, I mean, here's just we saw earlier the ways in which certain key words get repeated in relationship to enlightenment, to Zionism. So here's from online sites, right? Electric Intifada and the New Arab. In this case, the University of Illinois shows us how the neoliberal means enlightenment, university, right? That's enlightenment's still bad, right? How the neoliberal university allies with itself with Zionism as a settler colonial project. I mean, you can't get any more in the sense what's bad about Zionism, right? Neoliberal Zionism, settler colonial project. And here from the New Arab, Israelis are slaughtering Palestinians and destroying their mosques with their amalgamation of Islamophobia, liberal Zionism, right? That's the problem. Liberals out. We're the problem. And neoliberal imperialism. So what, just to conclude, what the humanities need to be reborn in America. And part of the humanities being reborn is allowing for the difference of the Jew. The Jew is the original other. That's what other minorities must understand. That the Jew was always the antidote to a Christianity that would otherwise kill itself. We saw in the Holocaust, that's what it tried to do. It kills off its Jews, and in doing so, when you kill off the opposition, even though you hate them, when you kill them off, that's the end. And so the BDS issue, as I hope I've said in this very brief talk, is not just like a political, it's a cultural issue. It changes the way people think. It changes the way we educate our children. It's very, very urgent. Thank you, people. Sorry I went on so long. And sorry about that mishap.
Thank you very much, Bill, for a very important lecture, and you're doing very important work on the underpinnings of what we're confronting in terms of contemporary anti-Semitism. So thank you. The next speaker is Benny, and I see that Barry Cosman has joined us, so I'll introduce Barry when Benny is finished. So Benny, try to be succinct and welcome. The floor is yours.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
You're good. Yeah, we hear you.
So my talk, Charles gave me the green light to extend my talk for at least 2 hours. So I know the folks who are tuned in have a bottomless level of patience. So give me a heads up after an hour. If Ira or someone could just ping me at 10 minutes, I'd appreciate it. William, thank you. I'm going to talk about Adorno and Horkheimer, actually am I still there?
Yeah, we just
Benny, we hear you well. We hear you well.
Sorry, I thought I lost folks. So I'm going to talk about Adorno and Horkheimer and the utility, I guess, of critical theory. The only thing is I don't see the screen attendees, but you can hear me, so I guess that's fine, correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
we hear you well. You're good.
Okay.
And we see you.
So let me start with making sense of guilt, defensiveness, anti-Semitism. This is a sort of fancy sociological term that Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer developed after the Holocaust. And it was mentioned they were German Jewish philosophers who fled to the US, I think via Great Britain. And their early works after the Holocaust did not deal with the centrality of lethal anti-Semitism within the Hitler movement, but they did advance the understanding of anti-Semitism in response to the Shoah. And I think that's to strip down their theory, that's the major contribution these thinkers have had. And the general idea is, and I'm just this is sort of some kitchen sink psychology, and I'm only scratching the surface, is in response to the Holocaust, and again, this is mainly focused on Germans who carried out the Holocaust and not their collaborators. The Germans during that time in the 40s and 50s internalized pathological guilt about the crimes of the Holocaust. And in response, they started to beat up on Jews, at least not in publications, although there was some of that right after the war in the Munich based Süddeutsche Zeitung, that led to a protest against the paper right after the Holocaust because of anti-Semitism, but more in the sense of, you know, the Jews were to blame for the Holocaust, or you know, the sort of stuff that came out in Heidegger's Black Notebooks, if folks read that, where he uses this, you know, largely somewhat unintelligible language about a Jewish self-implosion, and all of that stuff, again, shifting the onus to Jews. But the idea, again, of the guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism is that Adorno and Horkheimer argued that Germans internalized this pathological sense of guilt, and in order to purge this sense of guilt, they would engage in more anti-Semitism, as I said, and blame Jews for Jew hatred, or find other ways to, again, shift the onus of blame to Jews. And of course, this notion wasn't just limited to the small German Jewish communities in the East and the West at that time, but I think my read is that Adorno and Horkheimer viewed all Jews, that is, the existence of American Jews, French Jews, British Jews, Israeli Jews, which will come later, conjured up extermination camps, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, etc. And those memories, not only for the Germans who carried out the Shoah, but also family members who were passive and indifferent, brought about this anti-Semitic response to the Shoah. Now, probably the best phrase that captured is actually from an Israeli psychoanalyst who the phrase has been attributed to him, Zivi Rex. It's there's still a lot of debate about it, whether the quote comes from him, but he, in very ironic and sarcastic terms, biting sarcastic terms, Zivi Rex said, and many of you I'm sure have heard this, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. And that quote neatly encapsulates or captures, I think, what Adorno and Horkheimer were talking about. Now, Zivi Rex said that in the 1980s, and there were other thinkers who started to develop, I think, this notion of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, even before Zivi Rex. That is a more modernized version. And there are thinkers, for example, in the late, excuse me, in the late 60s, Jean Amri, a Holocaust survivor, originally an Austrian Jew, who then changed his name to Jean Amri and wrote in French. And, you know, he described that anti-Zionism is largely anti-Zionism, that it contains the seeds of anti-Semitism. And that type of thinking started to develop, as I said, interestingly, among many of these left-wing thinkers like Jean Amri and the literary professor in Germany, Hans Meyer, who wrote his autobiography called The Outsider, who a Marxist also, like Horkheimer and Adorno and Omri was a leftist. I'm not sure if he would define himself as a Marxist, but also identified these assaults on Israel as a form of anti-Semitism. And Hans Meyer wrote in 1975, I'm quoting him, open quote, "Whoever attacks Zionism but by no means wishes to say anything against the Jews is fooling himself and others. The state of Israel is a Jewish state. Whoever wants to destroy it openly or through policies that it can affect nothing else but such destruction is practicing the Jew hatred of yesterday and time immemorial." And Jean Omri, and this is a very, I think, gorgeous quote, said, "Anti-Zionism contains anti-Semitism like a cloud contains a storm." So you can see, again, this very insightful recognition of what, folks now, or at least folks who study anti-Semitism, the normal, sane folks would say anti-Zionism is definitively anti-Semitism. This was already being written about in the late 60s and early 70s by these thinkers. And then other thinkers, including a playwright, and I do think this is interesting, Rainier Werner Fassbinder, wrote in his play in 1975, "The Garbage, the City, and the Death." I think this neatly captures also this idea of guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. Now that term is very long, and it's usually used interchangeably with secondary anti-Semitism, a phrase that means, again, secondary sort of in response to the Holocaust, or as a secondary outgrowth of an anti-Semitic phenomenon, namely the lethal anti-Semitic phenomenon of the destruction of European Jewry. I think that phrase was developed in the 60s, secondary anti-Semitism, by a student of Adorno, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 80s. But it's simply an outgrowth of what Horkheimer and Adorno had written. Back to Fassbinder, who wrote in this play, in which an anti-Semitic character, Hans von Gluck, declares, open quote, "And it's the Jews' fault because he makes us feel guilty, because he exists. If he stayed where he came from, or if they gassed him, I would sleep better," close quote. So you can see again, Fassbinder really in this play really delves into, I think, what Horkheimer and Adorno developed, and this form of anti-Semitism is largely non-existent in the United States and the Anglo-American world, but it's highly ubiquitous in Europe, especially Germany and Austria. And there's not a lot of literature on guilt defensiveness anti-Semitism. I sent around the essay by my friend, Professor Andy Markowitz from University of Michigan, where he wrote about it, an essay. I think the few articles I sent were distributed ahead of this. And Andy, who's fluent in German and many languages, I think gives a nice presentation of how this form of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism is played out with examples. The other thinker who's done a lot of work in this area is Henrik M. Broder, the journalist who has written an enormous amount of articles and books that cover, in many ways, with very sort of piercing examples, this form of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. To give you an example, just a current example, just last week, I believe, or I guess within the last few weeks, there have been these horrible floods in Germany, and the journalist, correspondent for German radio in Rhineland-Pfalz, said about the destruction of these floods that it reminds us on the Gaza Strip. That's her quote, open quote. "It reminds us of the Gaza Strip," close quote. So again, why is there a need to compare the destruction of the floods to the Gaza Strip? Again, it's a way of alleviating your pathological guilt about the Holocaust. And this is, I said, incredibly widespread in Germany, and it's not very well studied, and it expresses itself consciously and unconsciously. I believe there was a study in 2017 that sort of, these studies are very superficial. It tried to glean some of this guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. And folks were asked in Germany about the following statement, open quote, based on Israeli policies, I can understand people having something against the Jews. And this federal government report, citing another report from Social Democratic Foundation called the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, 40% of the respondents in Germany agreed to that statement that based on Israel policies. Again, I would interpret this as a form of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. I believe the number is significantly higher. German academics who study anti-Semitism, for the most part, for example, from the Berlin Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, spend most of their time trying to play down anti-Semitism, as well as policymakers and politicians will say, well, there's about 15 or 20% of Germans are anti-Semitic, a whole German anti-Semitic attitudes. The real metric for me is the guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. If you begin to interrogate Germans, in German, of course, about their feelings about Israel, and this is where my thesis comes in, you will see that the numbers begin to mushroom in terms of contemporary anti-Semitic attitudes towards Jews in Israel. When you, as I said, when you focus in on guilt-animated anti-Semitism in Germany. And my thesis is, and it's not anything original, is that what we have right now is in Western Europe and Central Europe is the Western and Central Europeans, I'm engaging in a broad-based generalization, so put this in scary quotes, won't forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. So Western European governments and Central Europe are so obsessed, pathologically obsessed, I would argue, with bashing Israel and demonizing Israel. And that's largely, from my perspective, because of the Holocaust. The only explanatory power behind the media obsession, the resolutions in nation states in Western and Central Europe, and the voting patterns of many of these countries against Israel is they are infected in many ways by guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, and they can't seem to get this bug out of their social psychology. And remember, in Volker Beck's on the call here, and from the Green Party in 2013 introduced a resolution in the Bundestag to demarcate Israeli products for punishment. They largely replicated the same language, they deny it, of a neo-Nazi resolution the year before in an East German state. Now, why would the Green Party just single out Israel and spend intense amounts of time to punish Jewish products from Judea and Samaria and show complete indifference to totalitarian regimes across the world that are engaged in similar territorial disputes? My argument, I would submit, is the Green Party, many of its MPs, are filled with guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. Now, one could argue, well, the Greens tried to make up for it because they condemn BDS as anti-Semitic. Yes, but in practice, they are still pushing anti-Semitic measures and in part of anti-Semitic BDS organizations like Nuripur, Omen Nuripur, an MP who refused to resign from a pro-BDS entity, even after the Greens opposed BDS.
Ben, you have about a minute. One more minute.
Other politicians in Germany, we have a commissioner in Baden-Württemberg right now who's tasked with fighting anti-Semitism, but in a very weird way, he's compared a German Jewish woman who fights BDS and helped get Roger Waters off the television networks for his BDS activity, and he compared her with Adolf Eichmann. And he spends time trafficking in anti-Semitism to the point where the Simon Wiesenthal Center told Michael Blume last week to stop. His job is to fight anti-Semitism, not spread it. I would argue again that this is a person who's animated by this type of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism, and can't deal with criticism from Jews and Israel, and his mode of thinking degenerates in this. Now, there's a lot more on this topic, and I just wanted to tell William that I do think Adorno and Horkheimer and critical theory should not be completely dismissed. This is just my personal view, because even later, Adorno criticized the German left, called the police on them, if you remember, during one of his lectures, because they were about to attack him. And he viewed, and there's a famous passage that actually this was Horkheimer, the new progressive outlook is conservatism, a conservative outlook. There is a passage. So does that mean there's a shift to neoconservative thinking or conservative thinking? I would argue probably. And I think at least Adorno recognized the German left and their resentments against Israel and Jews experienced a turning point in the late 1960s after the Six-Day War. So I think it's a mixed bag. I'll end there because this is an enormously complex topic. I didn't even get through 30% I wanted to cover, but thanks for listening and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Benny, for an important contribution. Thank you. Please stick around. We'll do a Q&A after. I see Barry Cosman is here. So Barry, welcome. Barry is a research professor emeritus of public policy and law at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And he's the founding director of its Institute for the Study of Secularism and Society and Culture. He's a senior associate of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies in Oxford. During his career, he held executive positions with the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London and the Board of Deputies of the British Jewish Community and the Council of Jewish Federations in New York. In 2019, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Humanist Association. So today, we're fortunate to have Barry speak. He's going to speak. The title of this talk is The Uniqueness of Anti-Semitism and How Do We Explain Its Widespread Appeal. So Barry, the floor is yours and welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, at least from Connecticut. Look, anti-Semitism is not only the longest recorded prejudice, it's also the most widespread. And we have to explain its persistence, why it is so appealing as a notion to so many people. And I would say there are some very practical, realistic underpinnings to this. One is the Jews have been around a long time. If you're around a long time, you come into with an ideology, if you call it Judaism or whatever you call it, and a belief system and a philosophy that has clashed with pagans and Christians and Jews and Muslims and communists. Anywhere where the Jews have been in intellectual battle, which is really what we're talking about, with other forms of ideology. The other part of it is, of course, is the Jews have lived everywhere from Copenhagen to Shanghai. So they're going to be around lots and lots of people. No wonder in the prior to the sort of late 20th century, no other people was as dispersed with a diaspora that was deep rooted in so many countries for so long because of the, after 2000 years of exile, which means you have two particular themes, which I don't think are stressed enough when we look at anti-Semitism. There is this, what I would call intellectual anti-Semitism. It's ideological, it's philosophical, it's based on opposition to Judaism and Jewish thought and Jewish patterns of thinking. And that's what we might call the Jews, right? It's not like the mythical Jews, but the Jews, the Jewish civilization, if you want to call it that. Then you have the other side of it, which is the Jews themselves, those who are who are living amongst you, those who you see, those who act as agents in society. You might regard them as subjects, but you also regard them as agents in society. So the intellectual ideological one is, let's take Freud, who sort of deals with that with the book on Moses, that, it's you can put it in psychological terms, but it's very important that the Jews preceded Christianity. You've got the anti-Judaism. You've got the fact that the Jews annoyed Calvin by not supporting him. They annoyed Muhammad by not supporting him. But it's not just the ordinary Jews. It's the Jews as not only as a group, but Jews with their intellectual baggage. Then you have as I say, the Jews as a population, which will have their own socioeconomic characteristics, which to some extent also cause problems. In societies in general, you get people who are jealous of success, who don't like their neighbors, who want to steal from them, who want to rape them, or whatever it is. Lots of groups face that. Very few groups face this double wedge thing. But it's kind of what we might call high culture and low culture. The culture of the intellectuals and a an anti-Semitism of the intellectuals. Therefore, where do we look for it? We look it for the churches and the religious institutions. We look at it in the universities. We look at it in culture. The Wagner and the German intellectuals who not only worked in universities but wanted to remove Jews from orchestras. They had an intellectual imperative, a philosophical one, ideological, but they also had a personal one. And it's important to realize, therefore, that this intellectual side is very important for the myth of the Jews. The Nazis controlled the universities in Germany and Austria before they controlled the streets and the organs of government. Now, why is that the appeal? Because there is a intellectual, ideological battle going on against Jews and Judaism. The streets were later. Now, let me just give one example quickly. 2019 general election in Britain. The issue for the first time since World War II became a major party, the Labour Party in Britain, led by Jeremy Corbyn, was deemed as anti-Semitic. The chief rabbi of Britain appealed to people for their better halves not to vote for them. Who voted for the Labour Party? People who voted for the Labour Party won most of the university towns. The majority of graduates voted for the Labour Party in that election. The working class, interestingly enough, as we know, Boris Johnson won them over with his breaking the Red Wall. So you had a completely, it was the educated people who were anti-Semitic in this case because of what we've heard before, this tremendous intellectual, political anti-Zionism that became very popular, has become very popular in the West. On the other hand, of course, the ordinary people in the streets still going for pogroms, boycotts, pillage and looting, but all people do that all over the world. But it's important to see that in the 20th and 21st centuries, the two sides of this, the intellectual anti-Semitism and what I would call the street anti-Semitism, came together in the concept of modernity. And why did they come together? For the very reason that as countries became more democratic, more people had the vote, the upper classes needed to mobilize the masses. And anti-Semitism became, of course, a useful mechanism that you could, because it had this strong intellectual, philosophical underpinning, which was very deep. People who were Christian knew about deicide, and also the practical side. And of course, people like Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, already knew about this ressentiment, the resentment of success. The Jews at the same time have become successful. They were able to manipulate the work quite effectively within the capitalist system. They got big businesses, they win Nobel Prizes, they are a target for jealousy. For instance, so came together, of course, in Germany as the Nazis came to power. It wasn't obvious that the Nazis were going to take over, but Heidegger immediately in 1933 put out his letter for the backing a National Socialist University. Now, why did they want a National Socialist University? So that they could take the posts of the Jews. Within 2 years, German universities not only expelled all their all the students. The Germans took, when the Germans and the Nazis walked into Austria in 1938, in March, they removed 300 medical professors and staff from the University of Vienna Medical School. And at the same time, they removed all the Jews from the Vienna Philharmonic. So we come to see these two things coming together. There's motivation here, but the motivation has to have some kind of intellectual underpinnings, one of which was, of course, for the Nazi racism, that the Jews were a cancer, that you would make the world better if you remove the Jews. Many today, many of the Islamists believe the same thing. These people are Satanists, and if you get rid of them, the world will become the world will improve. So this comes together, of course, I mean, people have put these things as saying this is a conspiratorial justification, the conspiracies of the Jews. And it's a nice way of putting that there's a cultural phenomenon of the myth of the Jews act collectively as an agency, either to undermine society or to take it over. But it's the uniqueness and why the Jews are such a target is because that comes together with a local reality. There are Jews around who seem to be doing better than you. And they are, people who you can, if you could remove them, you will get, your life will improve. And I think that explains why it's not just Christianity, Islam, communism, etc., which do it. It's the appeal of that plus the practical side of a human resentment and human greed that makes the Jews a target. Also, so it's varied, this anti-Semitism. I mean, you get that there. And that's why it's such a difficult thing to get your hands around or arms around. If the local Jews are a proxy for Jews as a myth, then you're free, and they've been around a long time, you are free to choose any accusation, right? Even the most, we know anybody who fights anti-Semitism knows it's totally inconsistent. The Jews are cliquey and they want to be mix amongst themselves, but they want to also infiltrate all your clubs and institutions. The Jews are capitalists, but at the same time, they're all communists. I mean, these things are totally inconsistent, but they don't have to be consistent. What they have to do is be appealing, right? And as long as you dress it up in the same way and you can provide a motivation and a reason for persecution, discrimination, etc., which is done increasingly by political leaders, or was done in the past, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, then it expands. It becomes very appealing. That means it's very hard, as we know, notoriously hard to combat. With facts and reasoning, you can't really get the job done. And it also, most of the time, you're trying to prove a negative, right? We're not this, or we didn't do that, or we didn't do. That's I think is the crucial difference between anti-Semitism and so many other forms of discrimination, or what's now called racism. And the Jews are fighting, therefore, on a much wider intellectual battlefield. They're part of there's a the Western Front, there's an Eastern Front, there's a Northern Front, and a Southern Front. They are fighting both the left and the right, and sometimes the center. All of them have a motivation or a willingness to think badly of Jews or to criticize Jews and Judaism. So I think that is why it's a widespread appeal. It's the only real global hatred around, which can be found lots of places. And the intellectual side of it is, of course, I'm calling the ideological one, means you don't even, although it works best when there's lots of proxy local Jews that you can take it out on and get your practical benefits. But at the same time, you don't have to have Jews around. You can have Shakespeare, where the Jews have been expelled from England, putting out anti-Semitic propaganda. You can have people in Japan, where there are no Jews, believing in anti-Semitic theories or conspiracies. So that's because of the intellectual side. But if you've got real Jews on the ground being successful, then you have a more appeal for this. It's not just the intellectuals. And now, so that explains, I think, the whole question that we've been talking about, the anti-Zionism. The more successful Israel is as a Jewish state, and that's why the Western support has eroded amongst the intellectual classes, and a lot of the upper middle classes, if you want to call them that, in the West, where they were supportive in 1967, and thousands of Germans and Dutch people went after the kibbutzim to be volunteers. That is eroded because Israel is now a successful state. You got successful Jews. I mean, and it comes up with the COVID-19 vaccines. Why does Israel do so well? Why are they getting all the vaccines? Why, the Jews are too clever for, we haven't got any, the Jews have got them. It comes up all the time. So I think the appeal there is unique. And we could go through lots and lots. I could give you lots of examples from history. I could give you, but I think this two-prong, two-layer, the sort of the upper intellectual side and the lower, very practical street anti-Semitism come together. And the political leadership in many places wants to work both. It needs, if it's trained as in universities to require intellectual underpinnings for its thinking. At the same time, it wants the power that comes from enticing the masses or mobilizing the masses to follow them, and it comes together. So that's why the classic situation was National Socialism. That was there. It's very, very National Socialism was a utopian movement, utopian idealism at certain levels, and the utopian idealism was the eradication of the Jews. Everything would be good for Germany. If you look at the Marxist view as well, look at Karl Marx. To some extent, the Jews are a class. They're exploiting the masses, and therefore the Jews don't have to be eradicated as a people, but they have to. Judaism is a class conspiracy, if you want to call it that. And the Jews are the nexus of capitalism. Therefore, you have to remove Jews. You have to have a kind of cultural genocide of the Jews to make the world better, for the laboring poor.
Larry, can you sum up in a minute, please?
Yeah, I've summed up.
Okay,
I've
cool.
repeated. I told you what I told you.
Thank you.
Told you repeatedly what I see this as the uniqueness of anti-Semitism, and I think you compare it with other forms of racism and prejudice. Nobody has this Chinese menu, if you want to call it that, to draw upon. It's a cafeteria, but it is a very strong, powerful idea because it appeals right across the spectrum of human thinking, which is both, if we want to call it philosophical, spiritual, at the same time, the material animal side as well of humans.
Okay. So Barry, thank you. Thank you very much. And Benny and William. And I think the three of you in your unique way point to the severity of anti-Semitism in that it seems to have once again, it was certainly part of the educational system or the underpinnings of education during the Christian religious period, during the nationalist racist period. You all spoke about the underpinnings of anti-Semitism. And I think now in social theory and philosophy, it's reemerging in the sort of postmodern woke moment. And I think that if our education system contains this disease of anti-Semitism in social theory and philosophy, in pedagogy, curriculum, it's extraordinarily dangerous because we know as scholars that future citizens are influenced, socialized. They learn to become citizens primarily in universities and the university system. So if the humanities, as Bill points out, or Middle East studies or other departments are turning out people that hate Jews or notions of Jewish peoplehood, maybe not as much as they did in terms of religious forms of anti-Semitism or racist forms of anti-Semitism, but now the attack on Jewish peoplehood. I think that this is perhaps the most alarming element of contemporary anti-Semitism, maybe more alarming than the thugs on the street, because this is where citizens are being trained to function and take up leadership roles in our society. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. And again, I'd like to reiterate, these are ISGAP conversations, and ISGAP conversations, you are encouraged to ask critical questions. You don't have to agree with the speakers. Speak freely. We, as scholars, we're coming out of this environment that was so eloquently examined by our three speakers. So we're coming from a space where these issues are prevalent. So speak your mind, ask critical comments. The floor is yours. So anybody with a question, please raise your electronic hand. And I see Matthew Hone as the first speaker, and please You can speak with me in the chat too, and raise your hand, your electronic hand.
Okay, thank you, Charles, and thank you. All the lectures were excellent. My question is for Benjamin. When you talk about guilt, defensive anti-Semitism in Europe, can we link that to in any way to comparative victimology, like what's going on with a lot of the collaborative nations that were collaborators during the Holocaust, like Croatia, for example, in where they commemorate the Bleiburg, what they say, the Bleiburg massacre that happened after the Second World War, but at the same time deny their role as perpetrators under the Ustaše government. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, I would suggest, just because that's Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, is not, with the exception of Greece, is not really my expertise in terms of this area. I would suggest you also look at the writings of Dr. Ephraim Surov from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who heads the center here in Jerusalem, not too far from where I am right now in Jerusalem. And Dr. Surov has done a lot of work about this type of anti-Semitism in Lithuania, the Baltic countries, and their efforts to sort of play down their complicity in the crimes of National Socialism. My sense is, and I don't want to dodge your question, but my sense is, just to shift to Western Europe, is, and this is again my thesis, is that the Western Europeans who collaborated, for example, the French and the Spaniards through indifference, Italy, all the countries that were involved in exterminating their Jewish populations and played a role, are affected by this. Some of the population and policymakers and lawmakers are affected by this notion of guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. And again, as I mentioned, the only explanatory model for this rather insane pathological infatuation with the state of Israel via the media and power politics, I would submit, is guilt defensiveness, anti-Semitism. The presence of the Holocaust is so ubiquitous in the cognitions of Western Europeans, because they view family members being complicit in the Holocaust via indifference or actually carrying out the crimes, as I mentioned, of the National Socialists. So I do see that in Western Europe. Britain's a different example because it has a colonial, I don't consider Britain part of this analysis, but what you're talking about in Croatia is very interesting. And again, there needs to be a lot more research. My sense is with those crimes, it deals more with Soviet communism in these countries, and the crimes of Soviet communism were the functional equivalent of the Hitler movement's Holocaust. And you get into this whole debate about Eastern Europeans belittling the Holocaust or playing it down because they have their own, because they did in fact experience suffering, which I don't want to negate under the Soviet communism, but it definitely needs a lot more research. I'm not really sure if I answered your question, but it's a very important question that warrants a lot more research.
Thank you. No, you answered my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, both of you. The next question, Noreen Rahim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. My question is for Mr. Benjamin as well. So in recent years, we have been seeing in most of the Muslim majority states in South Asia and the Central Asia to ban the Israeli products every now and then. Whenever something happens, they tend to follow this practice. So I was wondering if you could have seen the original way of this type of practice. Is it the neo-Nazis who are promoting this type of practice to the greater world, or is it the Middle Eastern countries which are promoting Israeli banning to the greater community?
Thank you, Noreen. I just have a follow-up question for you. When you say banning, you mean sanctioning Jewish products, Israeli products, that type of stuff, like BDS activity?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, again, a great question. I'm just sorry. Where are you from? Where are you calling in from?
Yeah, I'm from Bangladesh.
Oh, wonderful. Are you in Bangladesh right now?
Exactly.
Oh, cool. Okay. It's always, I don't think I've ever had a Zoom call with someone actually in Bangladesh, so it's wonderful. And thanks for your question. Well, you know, it's again, this isn't my area of expertise, South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. So it's a tough, you're throwing me a real curveball here. My sense is with the BDS activity, based on my writings and over the last, and I've been covering BDS now for almost 15 years, really, roughly since the BDS campaign started in 2005 in Durban, in South Africa, right? That was the formal, well, the formal announcement came from that period. But I think it's largely driven, this BDS style anti-Semitism, from Western European countries, the Anglo-American world, Canada, United States, again, college campuses and Palestinian organizations within Great Britain, Canada, the US. They're pushing this desire to sanction Israeli products. As I mentioned, the German Bundestag was involved as early as 2013, and then the European Union in 2015 replicated the German Green Party decision to penalize Israeli products from the Judea and Samaria with labeling. No other territorial dispute has achieved the labeling system, only Israel. So the Middle East, surprisingly, especially in light of the Abraham Accords, and I'll end here, actually the opposite is happening in many cases, if you see it, with Israel's new accords, diplomatic accords with Bahrain, Morocco, the UAE, Sudan. All these countries are, basically not leading the BDS campaign against Israel. So Muslim majority countries that Israel has relations with, Egypt, Jordan, and these other countries I mentioned, are not in the forefront of BDS. It's mainly, I guess, these, as my other speakers said, it's mainly these sort of woke, super woke class of people in the West who are involved in this type of BDS activity. And then, of course, it spreads to other countries. But we've had in Israel here, I should note, we've had speakers from Indonesia and journalists appear in Israel, and even though we don't have diplomatic relations with Indonesia. So for what it's worth, again, thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. There's a good question in the chat. I would like to invite Kadaro Shah to ask his important question. Do you mind addressing the group with your question?
Certainly, I'll address the group. So my question is just regarding the era that we live in. A lot of persons that I find myself surrounded by are walking on eggshells, so to speak. They're incredibly concerned about what they say. They feel like they have to be almost perfect in what they articulate, because people are judging every word in which they say. And I don't think that this environment that's created is the best environment for growth and development, because people can't even articulate what's on their mind, what they're truly wrestling with, if they're not aligned with, I guess, particular groups or things of that nature. I actually brought this point up in class one time before, and everyone was stunned by my bringing up this point. So I'm just presenting this question to you regarding like aspiring academics. Like we're seeking to promote truth in an environment that's ideologically possessed, in my opinion. So what is the advice that you have with respect to persons who are seeking to pursue careers in academia, given the current state of affairs?
Be very careful.
An important question. So William, why don't you take the question, and then Barry, if you chime in after.
I'm not so sure. Maybe, Cordero, we should talk some other time, and I can give you professional advice. But I think you're right to point to a problem in the American university system now, that there is so much pressure to kind of check the boxes off. And that's not really what we do. I mean, that's why my emphasis so much is on the humanities, which is, humanities is not teaching a message like neocons will claim. It's not teaching values. Humanities teach how to read. And if you learn how to read texts, you can actually learn to read other people. As far as the professional advice, I'll send you my email.
Okay, perhaps I should come in here. Look, I think there is I think the questioner has got it correct. There is a kind of totalitarianism atmosphere on many campuses today and in academia in the West, which just reflects what the situation was in Europe before, or Eastern Europe, before 1990s. Everybody knew there were certain questions that couldn't be asked. There were certain subjects which were verboten or prohibited. Which went from, sort of, what is the role of trade unions to how much meat is in the shops. So we are in a situation where people are very worried. And there's an atmosphere, which, at least in the American system, it's like the Salem witch trials, a situation where people are concerned about being accused and shunned or shamed. And it is, I think it's very dangerous into intellectual life, to the society as a whole. But it's not just in universities. I go out there and play sports with people these days, and many people turn around and say that they're fed up with the fact of being told what to say and what not to say. And any of those of us who spent time in Eastern Europe in the 70s, 80s, 90s know that this is the situation. And of course, it was not only the communists but also the Nazis that told children to spy on their parents and denounce them. And it's the question, I think, is the denunciation. And the other side of it, of course, is that, and it's so insidious. It's a bit like Stalinism, where people begin to confess to crimes they haven't committed. So that's, I think that's part of the problem that we face. So I think you have put your finger in it, and I think it's a very, very difficult situation for any kind of, I would call them dissidents now, who don't subscribe to the current wokeness on university campuses.
Also, Kadora, if I can just say, we're having a small group here at Pembroke College in Oxford, and we've been meeting in the morning. And this very subject was a major theme of our conversation. And I won't go into the details, but everybody is concerned about these issues and academic freedom and how that impacts our careers. And I remember in the conversation, I quoted Henri Bernard Levy. And Henri Bernard Levy said that the primary responsibility and job of an intellectual and a scholar is to shed light where there's darkness. And it's coming at a price, but do we want a career in academia, or do we want to be true intellectuals and take the responsibility that we have in this privileged position to do research and do this type of conversations and analysis when many people are hard at work? We're sitting around having conversations. So I think to be an intellectual, as opposed to developing a career, we have certain responsibilities, and we have to be wise and smart, but I think we have to pursue our task at hand, which is to shed light where there's darkness, especially on issues that are so detrimental to an identifiable group and to the basic values of or principles of democracy. So not easy. So we have another question. I see Louisa. Could you please ask your question to the group?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for free speakers today. I would love to hear from them about their opinions on new definitions of anti-Semitism. We know that there is a definition from IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and the new one, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. It's a new one from May this year, as far as I remember. It is supported by some scholars in Israel, in the United States, in Europe. And I would love to hear your opinion on it, because the last one, the Jerusalem declaration does not include, it does not criticize the BDS as far as I remember. So could you please make a comment on this new fight on this issue of definition of what anti-Semitism is? Thank you.
May I jump in here? Just 2 quick points.
Go ahead, Benny. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Jerusalem Declaration is a bad definition, and it's deeply flawed, and I reject it. I think the
Why is it
AI,
Ben, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Why is it a bad definition? I mean, quickly, why is it bad?
right, because as she mentioned, it doesn't capture BDS, and it waters down the most ubiquitous form of anti-Semitism right now, and that's the efforts to dismantle the state of Israel. That's just, it's common knowledge right now that if you just look at what took place during the Gaza war, the attacks on Israel, that's become the main form of anti-Semitism, to quote a number of scholars, where Israel's become the collective Jew. And that's just my take on this. Folks will have different, I understand, perspectives. The IHRA definition that was mentioned, I do think is a good definition. I do think it's also flawed. And it can be improved. 2 areas where I would submit improvements is it should outline blaming Jews for jingoism or war efforts, which actually dates back to the Hitler movement, but increased in its intensity during the second Iraq War, during the Bush period. The Jewish members of the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, were frequently targeted as being the individuals or agents who stoked this war in Iraq. Whether you agree with the war or not, the Jews were singled out. So the blaming war on Jews, I think there should be a way to formulate that. And the second component I would add that needs to be included, obviously I have a bias because I'm doing a talk on it right now, is guilt defensiveness and anti-Semitism. So those are my 2 cents.
Good. William, would you like to say something?
No, I was interested in that. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I think the presupposition of the question is that these definitions are politically motivated, and that's, just you have to kind of figure out what are the different political motivations behind them.
Well, can I just
Go
say
ahead.
something about BDS?
Sure.
Because historically, the boycott was a classic anti-Semitic act. It was always directed to hurt the Jewish population, Jewish merchants in Poland and in Germany. And it fits a kind of stereotype of the Jews. If you hit them in the pocket. Now, I know that some of the people who look at this, obviously they want to undermine the economic position. We had the Arab boycott for many years in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very powerful, stopped Israel getting Coca-Cola, getting oil. But I think it's a classic anti-Semitic theme, the concept of the boycott. And it appeals, I think, not just to sort of from a political point of view. I think it's kind of a gut thing. Hit the Jews. They're all they're interested in is pieces of silver, and it goes back to that kind of underlying hatred. And so I think the boycott side of it, that we have to fight that as much as possible, because it just otherwise we're giving the opposition an opportunity to voice a classic anti-Semitic stereotype.
Thank you. So we don't have much time. We have less than 10 minutes. So Paula, please ask your question.
Okay, first of all, I just want to thank, who just spoke, Barry. That is a really wonderful way, I think, to respond to the boycott by referring to this notion of this stereotype of the Jews. I actually think that would be a very useful piece of rebuttal to the boycott that I haven't heard before, and that I think could have an effect. But I wanted to ask Benjamin about Holocaust studies in the US, which has been very prominent and robust for a long time. I mean, I'm from New Jersey. It's mandated in New Jersey. I don't understand why young people now who have had a whole curriculum of Holocaust studies in the public schools appear to either have forgotten what they learned with respect to Israel and other issues, or perhaps are responding to that. Even my own children have said how annoying that curriculum was. They found it tiresome. They found it bludgeoning. And it's a very interesting issue because you would think that this would have raised the consciousness. So I'm wondering, is there some kind of defensiveness going on there? I just wonder if how Benjamin sees that, because students in the US really should know about the Holocaust. I mean, maybe not all of them across the country, but in certain very elite areas, they should. And those are the areas where you find the most woke students.
Well, I mean, I'm not an academic, thankfully. Just joking, for those on the call. But I mean, I guess I would defer. I'll try to give you my 2 cents up, but I'll defer to Barry and William to delve into your question, because it is a very good question. I think Tablet just did a piece on the Tablet magazine, which is a very profound magazine with very deep pieces on anti-Semitism and other areas of Jewish thought about this very topic, how education actually contributing to a higher consciousness about the Holocaust, or the opposite. And there was a recent study showing the correlation does not appear to be true. That is, those who are highly educated or have been through education don't have a real understanding of the Holocaust. And in Europe, where I've spent most of my time, in Germany for 15 years, you know, the level of academic anti-Semitism was quite high, and intellectual anti-Semitism. In fact, most of the outlets like Der Spiegel, Germany's most popular magazine, or highest circulation, one of its owners who writes a column was writing a column after column filled with anti-Semitic tropes. Jacob Augstein, the Wiesenthal Center, put him on their anti-Semitism list, and it caused a huge debate in Germany. But he was patently anti-Semitic, but folks wanted to defend him because he was an intellectual and he was the new Germany, you know, young in his 40s. But putting that aside, I tend to think that this question really requires, I guess, new forms of pedagogy, and I'll just defer to William and Barry on this for now.
So I think that part of the problem is that people are tired, and not for good reason, of what they consider to be Holocaust rhetoric. They're also tired about the Jews' enthusiasm about their own past. Other nations don't do it to the extent that we do. And I think that dovetails with the really problems we have as educators. That is, our students are very, very quick, I think American students, to categorize any kind of defense of Israel as extreme right. And I feel like myself in the talk, I mean, I give like a greatest hit of, you know, of anti-Semitism. But we that language works among ourselves, but it's very hard, I think, when we get into college campuses to find a way of speaking to people where they don't already say, you know, I'm not listening to you. It's just rhetoric. Charles, I think it's a big question for what you guys are doing.
Let me come in here, because one time I had something to do with the Soviet Jewry movement, and I worked for an organization that had relations with the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And the fact was that for 70 years, there were all schools and all educational institutions in the Soviet Union had courses in Marxist-Leninism. It vanished within about 4 or 5 years of the what we might call the counter-revolution. And so people believe what they want to believe. If the Soviet Union, with its tremendous propaganda outlets and the Communist Party, could not persuade people that Marxist-Leninism was a good thing, because people didn't want to hear it. And it strikes me, it was seen as political, it was seen as irrelevant to many of their studies. If you want to study physics, so you wanted to do, I don't know, French literature, why are you that you have to have this compulsory course in Marxist-Leninism. And I think that's the way students react. They, first of all, there is a kind of undercurrent of kind of resentment, I'd call it, against most of the impositions of a curriculum. So I also think Holocaust studies is kind of it's a unique. It's there's nothing else which is like it in those schools. Presumably, we're going to have. We're seeing what the reaction is to the systemic racism, the 1619 project, which is coming up. The large numbers of people in the country just say, yeah, well, enough of slavery. We've had 150 years to get over it. So I think you're going to get the same reaction. The large number of students either would be totally unimpressed, disinterested, or it may even alienate them. So forms of political propaganda, commissars, as they might be seen by opponents, are not very popular. So I think it's not just a question of pedagogy, it's the theme of what is it, the purpose of education, how does it fit in with the other subjects?
Okay.
But it is a problem.
Excuse me, no, we're running out of time and there's a lot of people with their hands up. So time is over. So what I would like to do very quickly is Risa and Andreas, could you please very concisely ask your 2 questions and then we'll turn it to the speakers. You haven't spoken yet in the program, so please, Andreas, you're first and then Risa.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I had, this is too much I wanted to say about Adorno, Horkheimer, and about Marx. Maybe I don't talk about it. So I just think that overall, I would say that the fans of the theorists are often worse than the theorists themselves. For example, with Marx or Horkheimer and Adorno, and I would like to argue, but it's no time now.
I know I gave it was very simplistic presentation.
Hold on. Okay, hold on. Risa, your question, and I'll turn it both questions to the speaker. Thank you, Andreas. Risa.
Okay, thanks. So all of this is obviously very depressing, but makes a certain level of sense to me when we're talking about non-Jews, both intellectual and so-called street people. I hate that expression, but whatever. My question is, for example, I have a 20-year-old son who's serving as staff at a Bonim Dror camp in Northern California. And he tells me that the level of anti-Israel rhetoric within that particular movement, and this is true of other Jewish movements as well, is very, very disturbing to him, to the point where he feels like he can't speak his mind on Israel. My question is, how do you deal with this within the Jewish community? I mean, the Jerusalem Declaration is a great example of that, wherein a large majority of people who signed off on that declaration are Jewish studies scholars and are Jewish themselves. So while I see, there's sort of one answer dealing with how do you combat this in the classroom with a general student population, how do you combat this with Jewish students and Jewish students not only in the university, but outside of the university in whatever movement it might be?
Okay, so two good questions. So literally we have about 90 seconds. So each of you.
I'm going to answer Risa very, very quickly.
Okay.
I think the problem is within the Jewish movement is not only the kids, is that they go home and they convince their parents also, right? Because the parents want to be progressive as well. The answer is, I think part of it is giving students a narrative that they can feel proud of. And that's what Charles is doing, and not narratives that are coming like out of Hasbara and where it's, where we just turn the allegory over. We need nuanced thinkers addressing these things with students so they can start to think for themselves.
Sorry, is there any way we can extend the question and answer? And I'll tell you why.
No, I'm sorry. No, we really can't. But you have 30 seconds, Benny. The floor is yours.
I just want good questions are better than good answers. And there's some outstanding questions here, and it's acutely frustrating. In terms of, I just agree with what William just said. And I think ISGAP is one prime example of where this type of interplay and new forms of pedagogy are emerging thanks to you, Charles. So that's it.
Thanks. Well, there's 65 research fellows connected to ISGAP, which is an incredible team. And we have to empower the team and empower this network of intellectuals to deal with anti-Semitism, because as Elie Wiesel always says, and I repeat this all the time, anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ever ends with Jews. And as William and all the speakers have been so powerfully and eloquently saying, that this is really a threat to our democratic institutions and principles, including the university. So very important issues. Barry, would you like the final word?
Well, I just have spent a lot of time telling the Jewish leaders at one time that they have to secure their base, rather than convincing neo-Nazis that, you know, anti-Semitism in Israel is a good thing. They had to spend more time making sure that the Jewish community was solidified behind its own, as we say, narrative or its self-respect. And I think that's one of the great problems that the Jewish community in the United States has faced, for many Jewish communities. So educating the Jewish public in history and politics is very important, and I think ISGAP is trying to do that. But it needs, and I'm speaking to the choir here, preaching to the choir, it needs the resources to go out there and do the job on a mass scale in the communities.
Okay, so listen, as Benny said, it is a bit frustrating. I know there are many more questions from well-informed, intelligent scholars. So it's frustrating that we can't continue this conversation.
There's always email.
Yeah, there is email, and everybody has everybody's email and contact information on the handbook. So if you have questions to the speakers, please feel free to write to them. And I'm sorry that I'm cutting everybody off. We have 25 minutes for a break, and then when we come back at 4 p.m. Oxford